recording now. Okay, so Ask the Expert. On today's agenda, this is our second Ask the Expert session, and we're going to be looking at the importance of data in making scaling decisions. The Brookings Institution are kindly hosting today as our expert on this topic to share their insights and some examples with us. And please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go along, unmute as we go along if you've got a question to a point as we're going through. But don't worry, because we also do have dedicated Q&A and discussion time later on in the session, designed for you to ask your questions and seek advice on scaling decisions that you might currently be making. The Impact at Scale Labs team at GSF are also going to be giving you an overview of their work, and we'll end with a quick wrap up so that I can share contact details and next steps with you. And just to let you all know, this is a space for having an open conversation, so please feel free to share your voice and engage with us. If you can switch on your camera for the session, brilliant. If you're able to put distractions aside for the 90 minutes we're together, even better, but welcome and please feel free to join in. So what is Ask the Expert? It's a new recurring online session, and it's designed so that our community can seek answers to pressing operational challenges that they may be facing. And so experts from within our GSF community and our wider network are here to try and help with that. We're going to be covering different topics throughout the year. And in our second session today, we are tackling how to use effective data, decision-making, and analysis to inform scaling decisions. And the reason we're taking on this topic is because we're aware that our community, many organizations are currently deciding whether to scale. Is scaling viable? They may be in the middle of scaling. They're not sure how to go about it. So we want to try and answer some of those questions today. The Ask the Expert sessions are designed for you, the community. So please don't be nervous to ask questions today, and they can be specific to your own work and organizations. The session will be really valuable if you are able to share your concerns and challenges so that hopefully you can take away learnings that will really be applicable to the challenge you're taking on at the moment. So I'd now like to hand over to the Brookings Institution. We have Brad Olson, Senior Fellow, who is joined by Maya Elliott, Senior Project Coordinator and Research Analyst. We also have Molly Weiss, Senior Project Manager and Senior Research Analyst, and we have Constantine Boucher from Youth Impact. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to the Brookings Institution.
Great. Thank you so much. What a treat this is to have a chance to talk with you all a little bit today. As mentioned, I'm Brad Olson, and I'm joined by Molly Weiss and Maya Elliott, and we're also really happy that Constantine Boucher is here from one of our real-time scaling lab partners, Youth Impact, and so he's able to share some of his perspectives as well. And gosh, let me see. I think maybe to set the context here, I'll let you know that the Real-Time Scaling Lab project, which I think you're familiar with, sits within Millions Learning. And Millions Learning here at the Brookings Institution sits within the Center for Universal Education. And at the Center for Universal Education, we collaborate closely with international partners and partnerships all around the world in order to accelerate education change and improve education quality, especially for the most marginalized learners, so that everyone around the world has the opportunity to develop via breadth of skills to thrive in this complex 21st century. And within the Center for Universal Education, our Millions Learning project since 2014 has been investigating scaling and trying to understand what scaling is and how scaling works. And so that's sort of the broader dimensions of what we're going to talk about today. In 2018, we began the Real-Time Scaling Lab project. And as many of you know, this is sort of something that's been ongoing. We're going to talk a little bit about that soon. But I want to talk just a little bit about scaling. I understand that many of you are already familiar with scaling, but I kind of want to start at the beginning. One of the things that we've learned from our work is that that's a strange term, and it can mean different things in different contexts. It doesn't always translate easily across languages. And so I just want to take a minute or two to kind of set the conceptual context here. The first question to always ask ourselves is why focus on scaling? There's so many different ways to approach educational improvement and educational systems change. Why scaling? One of the things that we've learned over the years is that there are a ton of promising or effective education innovations that will work at small scale, but very few of them actually translate to the large scale systemic change that we think is needed if we're going to create broad and deep education transformation. The funding runs out, the pilot project succeeds and then it just sort of fades away. Perhaps the efforts on scaling were thought about too late in the process. And so we've learned over the years that it becomes really important to think about scaling as a long-term, complex, deep way of embedding a promising education innovation. And we know that scaling isn't always the answer. Not everything that's successful should be scaled, and scaling doesn't always work. But we think that the best way to approach it is to ask a series of questions and to use data, which we're going to talk about today, to make sure that organizations that have some promising education innovations go about this work in thoughtful and careful ways. When we talk about scaling, in some ways we talk about it a little bit differently from how many folks have talked about it in the past. It used to be that scaling was sort of understood as project implementation, as a kind of short-term project mindset that has mostly technical dimensions, that is relatively simple, that doesn't take too long, and that tends to be technical in nature. What we think about when we think about scaling is, first of all, on a technical level, it's a range of approaches. Scaling can be deliberate replication of an innovation, organic diffusion, integration into national systems. There are many ways to go about this, many pathways to scale, but all of them have as their ultimate goal to somehow embed the innovation in widespread, deep, and lasting practice in a way that expands and deepens the impact, not necessarily the innovation. And so when we talk about scaling, we talk about scaling the impact of the innovation, not scaling the innovation itself. And that might be a kind of subtle difference, but I think it's an important one. We also conceptualize scaling in terms of systems approach. And so the goal is not to necessarily increase the range or the size of the innovation or the individual project, although we understand that that's the means to the end. But the end, as I mentioned, is about impact. And so a lot of times what we think about is the goal of scaling a promising education innovation is that it can attach itself to and it can actually make meaningful change in a whole education system. When we think about scaling, what we've learned lately is that it's not solely rational. It's very complex. It requires political dimensions. It requires empirical dimensions. It requires all the complexity of what it means to work with humans. In many cases, an innovation may have worked in one place, and so it's being brought to a new place, and that's part of the scaling work. When that happens, contextualization becomes very important. That's the term we use for the ability to adapt and contextualize an innovation for a particular location. There are surface ways to contextualize it. There are deeper ways to contextualize it. We think there are equity considerations when thinking about contextualizing a pre-existing innovation in a new location. And then we also are really thinking about the dimensions of equity. We don't see equity as a standalone or a separate topic within scaling for impact. In fact, we see it as a kind of transversal ribbon that weaves through all aspects of the scaling work: planning for scaling, designing and developing the innovation, conducting research, contextualizing the innovation, learning from and adapting the process of scaling along the way. We think that it's really important to prioritize equity around all of those things. Now, the last thing I want to say before I move on to the next slide is that it's easy to talk about scaling in the abstract, but scaling happens on the ground. And so it's concrete, localized work. And I think that focus always needs to be prioritized. I think I am going to turn this over to my colleague Molly now, who's going to talk in a little bit more detail about the real-time scaling labs. And then what we're going to do is offer you some of the learnings and some of the recommendations that we've generated over these last 5 years, and then open up a conversation, because we hope that what we've learned can somehow be valuable to you all and inform the work that you all are doing around scaling and education. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brad, and it's wonderful to be here with all of you today. So I'm just going to briefly tell you a little bit more about this real-time scaling lab project, where some of these key lessons come from, and then dive into this data topic specifically in a little bit more depth. So as Brad mentioned, in 2018, we at Brookings launched a series of real-time scaling labs with local partners, which were intended to generate more evidence and provide practical recommendations on this process of how to expand, deepen, and sustain the impact of education initiatives. And so these labs were a participatory action research approach, where we worked with 6 local institutions across 5 locations between 2018 and 2023. You can see them on the screen here. And we worked together to document and collectively plan for scaling, to discuss and reflect on challenges and opportunities that were arising in real time in the scaling process, and then to develop and test adaptations and course corrections to scaling strategies through an iterative learning process. So in each place, we focus on a specific scaling process with this partner, but then there was also a community for peer learning and knowledge exchange across the labs as well. So almost 5 years later, we have learned a lot through this lab process alongside our partners in each of the labs. We have engaged more than 760 stakeholders from government, civil society, school systems, and communities in the work of scaling. We've collected more than 430 pieces of data and documentation on the process of scaling, and published 45 reports, case studies, podcasts, tools, and blogs. So this last year, we published a seminal cross-case report that looks at the learnings from all of this data and tries to identify key lessons about scaling from across these cases. So this most recent report focuses on what we learned about scaling, what we learned about this lab approach, and recommendations for stakeholders. Happy to share a link in the chat for anyone who's interested. But today we'll really focus on some of the lessons about what type of data is important to collect and use to inform scaling processes, how this differs from typical M&E or proof of concept data, and the importance of building learning and reflection into scaling processes regularly. So I'm just going to briefly touch on why it's important to think deeply about how we collect, use, and share data as part of scaling, and perhaps to think about it differently than we have in the past. So of course, no one wants to waste precious resources, financial or human, on scaling something that doesn't work. Everyone agrees that data that demonstrates the impact of an innovation is really essential. We don't want to scale something ineffective. But even with that in mind, our research in the broader field of scaling science have shown that while impact data is important, it's not sufficient on its own to support scaling. The types of information, tools, and methodologies that are needed to monitor and evaluate a pilot or an initiative at small scale just aren't sufficient to the data needs of a scaling process, which often requires different sets of expertise or knowledge, different types of data, different approaches to gathering and analyzing the data. So in addition to looking at the impact, as we said, which is important, it's also really important to collect data on the process of scaling itself. So looking not just at the reach or scope, how many schools or how many children were reached, but other intangible aspects of the process, how capacity is being built, buy-in for the innovation across the system, leadership at different levels. It's certainly important to continue to monitor whether the impact is being maintained as the innovation is growing to a larger scale or going to new communities or with new populations. But it's also critical to look at what challenges or opportunities are arising in the process and what changes might be necessary to both the initiative and to the scaling strategy, including to address new differences that are arising in different contexts or as new people are reached, but also as there may be environmental changes, external shocks. So we'll go into this a little bit more in the next slide. But one challenge that we saw across these cases, and that was also noted in the broader literature, is that data is often seen as more of an accountability exercise than a learning experience. Being able to show, did we spend the money well? Did we do what we said we were going to do? But we do know that scaling is an iterative process. It inherently requires adaptation and course correction. This isn't a bug, it's a feature. This is how scaling needs to be. But teams that are leading the scaling process are often hesitant to share information about what isn't working or challenges faced, especially with their donors, and tend to focus more on indicators like students or classrooms reached. Similarly, it can be hard to share information that feels sensitive, like cost data, with external stakeholders outside a scaling team, because again, it feels like accountability. Did we spend the money correctly? But this reticence to share can make it difficult to identify the necessary adaptations that may need to be made for scalability, affordability, or to acknowledge when something isn't working and to course correct and then accurately assess whether this impact is being maintained as scaling progresses. Looking at these more diverse kinds of data beyond impact is also important to highlight potential future scaling challenges and think of ways to address them. So for example, gathering qualitative data about how school leaders may be engaging with the innovation might elucidate some of the challenges with the amount of time and energy that teachers are required to give the innovation, which could lead to resistance. So this could be an important piece of information as it might be a larger problem that will arise if the innovation extends to more schools. Another issue to highlight briefly is that we found that the scaling process is really rarely documented. People are so busy doing the scaling that it's hard to take the time to sort of pause and lift up their heads and say, why did we do it this way? How did this work? Do we need to do something differently? What did we learn? And this can make it difficult to understand how scaling is playing out in real time, and then to learn from this experience to apply those lessons to future work and share with others. Because so much of what was tried, why they tried it, how it turned out, ends up only living in the heads of a few individuals. At the same time, our research also showed that people who are working on scaling often face similar challenges despite contextual differences, but they're isolated. They're often starting from zero to respond to these challenges and don't have opportunities to learn from each other's experiences. This is another reason why collecting and sharing data specifically about the process of scaling can be really important. The last thing that I'll mention is that scaling tends to move in a stepwise fashion. It's not sort of a linear, gradual increase. It could be that nothing is happening for a while, and then suddenly a window of opportunity opens and progress accelerates rapidly. So in some ways, this can seem like luck. It happened that the stars aligned to present this opportunity for scaling. But we have found that sort of being aware of the environmental conditions, making close relationships, and then being prepared to act when an opportunity arises is really a matter of planning and preparation. And having sort of the data and analysis ready to share is really important to be able to leverage these opportunities when they do come up. So this might mean having the kind of information that scaling partners or the government will want. Again, not just information about impact, although that's important, but it could also be cost effectiveness data or information about how the program aligns with current or future priorities, evidence of how it can be contextualized. So with that, let me turn to Maya to get into a little bit more specifics about the types of data that are useful for scaling.
Sure, thanks, Molly. So yeah, what kinds of research and data are helpful for scaling? As mentioned by Molly, data about scaling is often different from the kinds of data that is collected from monitoring, evaluation, and learning activities. So we use a helpful framework developed by Larry Cooley and Julie Howard, which looks at 3 tiers of scaling research. And the one important thing I would note is these are not sequential necessarily. They can happen at the same time, and it often can be beneficial if they do because they can inform each other. The different tiers of research look at different aspects of scaling. The first tier is definitely the most common, and that's kind of proof of concept research that looks at the innovation itself and how effective it is. This is what most projects tend to do when they are researching scaling. The second tier focuses on the environment around the innovation and how the innovation might need to be adapted to scale. So this includes assessing different factors to see how difficult or likely it would be to scale, as well as understanding what adaptations need to be put in place to make scaling more feasible. There's a tool we can share in the chat called the Education Scalability Checklist, which can be really helpful for doing this kind of assessment to see where scaling might be easy and where it might be difficult. The third tier focuses on change management, and this looks at how to create changes that will allow for sustainable uptake and continued impact of the innovation. So questions at this level look at sort of what it will look like at scale and what adaptations need to be made to be sustainable when at scale. And often this means roles change during the scaling process. It may be that the originating organization is no longer the one implementing. It's been adopted by government or by other partners. And so what are the changes that need to happen for that to transition successfully? For this, we have a tool called the institutionalization tracker, which again, we can share in the chat, but this can be helpful for looking at different aspects of institutionalization, if that is your scaling goal, and assessing where progress is happening, where it's not, and seeing the change over time. We would say that kind of all of the learnings that come out of this are useful and they can inform each other. What is essential is that the data is not just collected and published at the end of a project, but used iteratively throughout the scaling journey to inform scaling decisions. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But for a second here, I'm just going to share briefly a few examples of different types of data the real-time scaling labs collected. And I think this list is great because it's a diverse group of data. This is not just impact data or quantitative data. A lot of different types of data were used to inform scaling. For example, some labs did interviews and focus groups with teachers to understand how they were experiencing the initiative. That was after it had even rolled out. So the scaling had happened, but they wanted to understand how was it being experienced. And it led to changes in the training approach that this organization used. Other labs collected cost data. For example, in Cote d'Ivoire, one of the labs collected cost data to understand different possible pathways for training teachers at scale. And the research showed that they had to move to a hybrid approach and understand different timeframes for in which that could take place. Meeting notes is actually a source of data, and it can be a really useful one. So collecting information from meetings with stakeholders can be useful for reflecting on progress, seeing who's in the room, who's not, what has been said, and what has changed over time. As I mentioned, we have the institutionalization tracker, which can be really helpful to use periodically. And there's a picture of it on the bottom right corner of the screen to kind of show how institutionalization made progress over time. A stakeholder mapping can be another type of data collected to understand who's working in the environment. One of our teams has done an extensive stakeholder mapping working across the team, the different countries they work in. And we're very intentional about including not just supporters, but also potential opposition or actors who are duplicating similar work in their stakeholder mapping to make sure that they were aligned with other actors. Quarterly reflection reports is also something all of the labs did, and that was useful both for documenting, but also for taking the time to stop and reflect. Scaling is busy work. It often gets lost in the day-to-day of implementation, of making sure everything is running. Taking the time to pause and think about what's happened and what's changed and what to do moving forward is really important. And something like a quarterly report can help facilitate those kinds of discussions. I'll briefly note that it's also really important to learn from others. And so case studies from other initiatives were also helpful. One of the labs learned about a teacher training approach focused on peer support circles for teachers that another initiative had done in Zambia. They learned from it and pilot tested it in Jordan. So learning from other scaling examples can be a source of data. And as can policy reviews. It's really important to align with the local environment. And so another team did an extensive policy mapping to understand where they could fit into the existing education strategy and priority issues. And then the last one we're going to hear more about in a minute from Konstantin Bushel. So I'll just say that another source of data that can be to refine the innovation, and something like A/B testing or rapid tests can be really helpful to find the most scalable form of an innovation. Before I turn to that, I'll just note quickly that data on its own is not useful. What matters is how it's used. So alongside making plans to collect data, it's really important to plan for moments to pause and reflect on what you are learning and plan for adaptation. Building space for adaptation makes it much easier to course correct along the way. For example, one lab found that building and review cycles was a way of making sure that everyone understood the innovation would necessarily need to change from its original model. And this wasn't a mistake, it was a natural part of the process. It's much easier to make changes when they are planned and budgeted for in advance, even when the exact change itself isn't yet known. The process of change is planned for. And scaling is a collaborative process. It can't be done in a vacuum or by one group. So ensuring that diverse stakeholders are involved in this data review process and making the decisions together is really important for generating buy-in and ensuring equity considerations are part of scaling. A cycle like reflect, learn, adapt, or plan, do, study, act can be helpful to kind of guide these collaborative reflection sessions. I'm going to pause here, and I am delighted to turn it over to Constantine Buchel, who's a research specialist at Youth Impact, to talk a little bit more about how they use data for scaling.
Thanks so much, Maya. Is it possible that I share my screen with my slides? Thanks so much. All right. I hope everyone can see my slides. Perfect. Just a second. Somehow I lost the screen. Anyways, all right. So I'm going to talk about our lessons learned from A/B testing and scaling decisions in TARL, or our insights. I'm a research specialist at Youth Impact, and we are an organization that has reached around 200,000 young people with our health and education programs. We have implemented trials and programs in 11 countries with partners, and over the past 3 years have run more than 25 experimental trials. And I want to talk a little bit about those and how we can use them to learn about scaling. And we have a memorandum of understanding with Botswana to scale our evidence-based programs nationally through government. All right, just to start us off with some terminology. So we use a lot of experimental trials and data in general to inform our programming decisions and scaling decisions. And I just want to distinguish briefly between two types of experimental trials. That is randomized control trials, which are often used to establish proof of concept. And then A/B testing, which are meant to optimize the program and to foster organizational learning and then inform scaling strategy. And these are the types of trials I want to talk about in this short presentation. So, both of these are tools, experimental tools to learn about programs. As I said, RCTs are mainly here to establish proof of concepts, and A/B tests allow us to optimize the program and learn. In RCTs, you typically compare a treatment group to a control group to measure the impact, while in A/B tests, we compare two versions of a program, version A and B, and these are often just small tweaks in the program. And then we want to learn which of the two versions works better and which we want to use when scaling. The time for outcomes to materialize is different. RCTs are typically implemented over many months or even years, while we run A/B tests on outcomes that we can observe after weeks or just a few months. Typically, RCTs are run, in a pilot phase, while we run A/B tests on a regular basis over a long period of time, periodically. So, for instance, in teaching at the right level, which I will talk about, we run about 3 A/B tests a year, every implementation every implementation period. And that's 3 terms a year. We run an A/B test. All right, so. Those are the two experimental tools that we use, and I'm going to talk about A/B testing. All right, so one thing that is important to understand on how we run things in Botswana and also in the other countries we partner with organizations is that we distinguish between 2 implementation models. One is direct delivery model, which we use as a lab. Essentially, that's where we run A/B testing. That's where we implement with our own staff, our own facilitators, and then run A/B tests to learn about the program and how we can optimize it. That's done at fairly low scale. I will come back to that. And then we have our path to scale, which is implementing with the government through regular teachers or national volunteers. And that's how we scale our programs, through government delivery. And the goal is to learn through A/B testing in direct delivery and then transfer the insights from direct delivery to government delivery, where we scale together with regular teachers and youth volunteers. All right, just to put some numbers behind that. So you see here a graph of our reach in teaching at the right level in Botswana, once for direct delivery and then once for government delivery. For instance, this year we have reached about 30% of primary schools through government-led delivery. It's just a very small percentage in direct delivery. So we are focusing scaling through government-led delivery with regular teachers and national volunteers, while we maintain roughly the same scale in direct delivery with our youth volunteers or youth facilitators, typically around 1,500 students per implementation term. So we don't intend to raise reach in direct delivery. It will hover around 4,500 to 5,000 students a year, but we focused scaling on government delivery, where we have reached 30,000 kids this year and probably will reach 50,000 next year. And so the A/B testing and the learning happens mostly in direct delivery. That's where we do the A/B testing. And then we transfer those lessons and insights to government delivery, where we scale the program. All right, let me say something about the objective of A/B trials. I already said it's meant to optimize the program. And what we have in mind here is, in particular, is cost effectiveness. Let me unpack that. So we distinguish broadly between two types of trials. One type of trials focuses on the effectiveness side. And there we are looking for small tweaks to the curriculum or the implementation protocol to increase the effectiveness of the program. And the idea is that these tweaks are small and especially cost neutral. And then we see whether these tweaks allow us to raise the impact effectiveness of the program. And if they do, we know that this will increase the cost effectiveness. And then we take those tweaks and also apply it in the curriculum that is implemented by regular teachers and national volunteers. So one example, and I will walk you through that example later on, is how do we subgroup when we have a lesson in teaching at the right level. Every group is made up of about 20 students. For about 15 minutes of the session, the students work in small groups together. The question is whether we want to group students by same ability or mixed ability. Doesn't really change the costs of the program, but if there is one way to do it more effectively, that's a potential way of increasing the cost effectiveness of the program. And we want to know that so that we could transfer it to the government-led scale model. So that's one type of A/B trials that focus on effectiveness. And then there is a second type of A/B trials, which especially once you have established a version of the program that is highly effective, A/B trials that focus on the cost side. And here we think about measures that allow us to, reduce costs and simplify implementation. Both is important for scaling. And then whether these cost reduction measures are possible without compromising the effectiveness of the program. So let me give you an example. So for instance, one thing that we wanted to understand better is whether we could shorten the training of those people that implement teaching at the right level, the facilitators, because trainings are one of the most important cost drivers of the program. And so if we can shorten the training of facilitators, we can reduce the costs. And if that's possible without compromising on the effectiveness of the program, that would be a great way to increase the cost effectiveness. You keep the effectiveness at the same level, but at the same time reduce the costs. So these are two types of, that we distinguish of A/B trials. One focuses on the effectiveness side, small tweaks that are cost neutral that allow us to increase the effectiveness of the program. And the other one focuses on the cost side. There we look for measures that have the potential to significantly reduce the costs. And then we want to test whether they compromise or not the effectiveness of the program. All right, so let me give you one example of an A/B trial that we ran in Teaching at the Right Level in Botswana. And that is the same versus mixed ability subgrouping. So Teaching at the Right Level is a program where you group children based on their ability, not their age. So we would level children at the start of implementation and then group children by their ability, not their age. And then a typical TORL session lasts for 45 to 60 minutes, starts with an icebreaker, then a whole group activity. Then you have a small group activity where children are grouped together and they work together on numeracy problems. Then they answer a checkpoint question individually, and then they wrap up with an icebreaker. And so despite that we group children already at the start of the program by ability, there is still some variance in terms of ability within TORL groups. And so our question was whether we want, whether there is a difference if we got subgroup children by same ability. That's what we usually do. That's our standard approach. And then we wanted to compare whether there is a case to be made to subgroup children by mixed ability, meaning that you put better performers together with less well performers, so that the better performing children can explain to the less well performing children how a concept works, and that might raise the effectiveness of the program. So we wanted to understand that better. So we ran an A/B test on the question, means that we implemented for one term, and at the start of implementation, we split the groups randomly into all the TORL groups into two buckets. Either the A bucket, that was the one that used same ability subgrouping, or the B bucket, that was those that containing the groups that did mixed ability subgrouping. So our level of randomization was the TORL group, led by one facilitator and typically about 20 students participating, 15 to 20 students. In this trial, we had 56 clusters across 18 schools, and we were implementing this across 5 regions in Botswana. Now, let me share some results. So the main results in our A/B tests come from our leveling data that we collect pre and post implementation. Then we can, for instance, calculate the share of participants who, learned at least one new operation in numeracy. And now we can compare the two A/B groups, same ability versus mixed ability, and we find that essentially the same share of children learns at least one new operation. Here it's 65% in the same ability bucket and 70% in the mixed ability bucket. But this difference was most likely by chance. It's not significant. The p-value is 0.85. So this is just a small difference that could be due to pure chance. So based on our pre-post data, we conclude that there is no good case to be made to switch from same ability subgrouping to mixed ability subgrouping. We have second source of data that goes into our A/B testing, that's weekly monitoring data. And one thing that we can learn from the weekly monitoring data is whether the field team complied with the A/B protocol. If they don't follow the A/B protocol, there is not much to be learned from the A/B test. And so from this monitoring data, we see that less than 10% of the field team members reported that they struggled with implementing the A/B test. It was 7% in week 1 and 2 and 0% in week 3 and 4. And all of them implemented the correct A/B test protocol in all the weeks. So we know that they complied with the protocol, so non-compliance doesn't explain that there is no difference between the A group and the B group. So that's the second source of data that goes into our A/B testing. And then the third source of data is that we also collect facilitator feedback based on what I call here an opinion survey. And here, for instance, we ask many questions to the field team. We want to know how they think about the two versions of the program that we implemented. For instance, we asked them which approach they consider more effective, mixed ability subgrouping or same ability subgrouping. Basically, we got the same share of responses favoring mixed ability versus same ability subgrouping. Many field team members said it depends on the group. Sometimes it can be more effective to use mixed ability subgrouping, sometimes same ability subgrouping. So kind of confirms also our results from the leveling, our main results from the pre-post leveling data. Probably there's not that much to be learned from, switching from same ability subgrouping to mixed ability subgrouping. And so what did we conclude and how did we transfer these insights to government-led delivery? We learned that ability subgrouping in these already fairly homogeneous TORL groups is not a decisive factor driving effectiveness. So it's not something that we focused on in our government-led trainings. We still recommend same ability subgrouping. It remains the standard approach, but it's not something that we focus very heavily in our trainings because there was just not that much difference that this made in terms of impact. All right, so this was an example on how we use A/B testing to learn about program effectiveness. As I said, another focus could be costs. I think that's also very important for scaling. How can we implement cost-saving measures without compromising the cost effectiveness of the program? And that's another focus. I haven't prepared an example for that. So let me stop here and then hand back to the Brookings team. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. And I'm going to hand over now to Habib from GSF. He is the Impact and Innovation Manager, and he's going to just talk to you about our impact at Scale Labs.
Right. Thank you very much, Steph. I'm also happy to share that Ursula is on this call. Ursula is our senior manager on MEL at the labs. So yeah, quickly, with the little time we have left, the impact at Scale Labs. I'll give a quick introduction about what we do at Impact at Scale Labs and how we're using data to inform scaling processes within the labs and with organizations in the labs as well. So the Impact at Scale Labs, we work towards transforming education systems by intensively working with local innovators to scale solutions. We start by carefully selecting promising solutions and then driving funding and specialized technical support to help them scale. There are 4 major components of the labs, but the one really in the context of this conversation is the test, learn, and iterate phase in the labs, where we support organizations to design and deploy tests for their solutions that they are working to scale, and helping them learn through that testing journey, and then use the data they get from the testing to inform how they are evolving their solutions and how they are designing their scale strategy. During that process, we also try to help them improve their capacities internally with regards to data maturity and ensure they build systems to help them measure the impact of their work. So far, we're rounding off the first labs, which we would be completing by next year, while the second lab which is focused on early childhood education, is currently kicking off in Kenya. So I'd like to share two cases of organizations in the labs who have used data to inform their scaling process. The first is Sabre, who is currently working on scaling their solution from the government sector, where they've achieved a lot of success, to the private sector, the affordable private sector in Ghana. The name of the solution is Transformational Teacher Training for Play-Based Learning. And they are working to get this to affordable schools across Ghana. In order to inform their scaling process in this space, they conducted a scoping study, and the objective of the scoping study was to help them examine the private sector's current provision for kindergarten education in Ghana, and to also help them understand how their work could be modeled in the private school sector. Where after they were done with the scoping study, they used the data gathered to the data gathered provided them a lot of insight on the current level of acceptance and appetite for training across private school kindergarten teachers in Ghana, which they are now using to design pilots for their training interventions. The second is Dignitas, who were launching the Lead Now app, a remote coaching tool for teacher development. So beyond the app, they were trying to examine what components they should deploy with Lead Now, which could drive the most engagement, the most impact, and also to reflect on what cost they would be incurring in deploying each of these components with Lead Now. So they did an A/B testing, which helped them gather data on various completion rates and knowledge gain across the various components when combined with Lead Now, which they are now using to inform the design of their program model as they're looking to scale in Kenya. So to further deepen and share our work on using data to inform scaling decisions, at the next annual meeting in February, Dignitas will be sharing the stage with Youth Impact to discuss how you could discuss finding problem and solution fit through testing, basically looking at how they've used data in the past and insights that they've gathered in deploying their solutions and finding alignments between the problems, between the solutions and the problem they're looking to solve. So this is something to look forward to. That'll be all from here. I'm happy to take questions in the question and answer section.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Before we go into our Q&A and discussion section, if it's okay just to take a quick screen grab of people for our community newsletter, if it's okay to pop on cameras if you can, just for a second, and I will take a quick picture for our newsletter, and then we'll get going into the questions. I'll just give everyone a couple of seconds. Thank you so much. That's perfect. Thank you. Okay. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat or just unmute and shout out and questions. Be as specific as you like. If we don't have answers today, we can get back to you by email. Yes, Kanupriya.
Thank you, Steph. And thank you to the presenters for an excellent discussion of some really complex situations that organizations that are working on scaling are dealing with. So my question is to do with measuring or documenting the scaling process, because I think the data approaches that we've heard about today are quite specific on measuring innovations, both the A/B testing as well as what was the other one we looked at? I forget now. But if you've had any examples of actually measuring scaling process and then adapting to incorporate your findings from that. Thank you.
Who would like to take that one?
I'll say a little something about that, which doesn't quite get to a full answer to your question, which I think is a very important question. And alongside the real-time scaling lab work we've been pursuing, there's also been the ROSI work, which is research on scaling the impact of innovations in education, which in some ways is similar. And I'll draw on that to say that one of the things we learned when the pandemic hit is that many scaling organizations had to change the ways that they were engaged in their scaling. For example, they couldn't send facilitators and supervisors across countries because of travel restrictions, or it was harder for them to engage the work of schools inside classrooms when the schools shut down. And so some of these groups had to make very quick adaptations. And in some cases, they actually studied the effects of the adaptations and learned that there were positive effects or knock-on effects from their changes that turns out to have been really wonderful attributes to the scaling. And because they paid attention to this and studied the effects, they were able to incorporate those changes into the work even when the pandemic receded. For example, one group was unable to work with students in schools. And so they developed these literacy backpacks, and they went to homes and they met with the parents to say, listen, we're going to give these literacy backpacks to you so you can help with your students in their literacy work. And two things happened. They got to know the parents. And so suddenly the parents were brought into the learning equation. And another thing that happened is this was a program that was focused on early literacy and therefore younger children. But as they went back a couple of times, they learned that the older siblings were also looking at those literacy materials. And so they very quickly started offering literacy materials for older kids because they took advantage of this sort of sudden opportunity. Now, being aware of this and noticing it and collecting some data on it allowed them to use data to notice the second effects of an adaptation that in fact were positive, that they could ultimately build into the scaling work. So there's one example.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Does anyone want to add on to that? Ursula?
I had some additional questions. So if anyone wants to add on to Brad's point, I will let them do that before I jump in with a new question.
I might just very quickly share one more example, which is a group that had engaged teachers together as a learning community. And when the teachers were no longer able to meet in the schools, this is in sub-Saharan Africa because of the pandemic and having shut the schools down, they created these new opportunities for teachers to work together in community areas, oftentimes outside, because if you remember early on in the pandemic, it was very scary to meet inside. And they developed a WhatsApp program where folks could actually engage in peer exchange around questions of practice. And so you had teachers meeting together outside the school environment, which creates a different dynamic and in some ways a kind of closer or more intimate engagement. And they were able to engage in the questions on the WhatsApp ICT and therefore talk about teaching in new ways. That was another example that came about because of the pandemic, and some data were collected and used in order to make the adaptation to the whole process. And so I think one of the things that both of these examples tell us is surprises will happen. And alert researchers collecting and paying attention to data can make use of the positive effects of the surprises and mitigate the negative outcomes of such surprises.
You want to go, Ursula?
Oh, thanks, Steph. I had two questions. So I think the first one for the Brookings team. We've experienced the same things that you flagged up in terms of MEL or data being seen or experienced more as like an accountability process rather than a learning process. So what is some advice that you would give to an organization or an organization leader who is seeking to move from the kind of accountability end of the spectrum more into a learning process? And then also for Konstantin, it would be really interesting to know, how did you or the broader Youth Impact team decide what adaptation you were going to test? So how did you make the decision about the mixed groups as kind of your next test? That would be super interesting.
I can briefly start for the questions for Brookings, and then Maya and Brad can add to it. I think one of the things that we found was beneficial in the scaling labs was creating a space for regular multi-stakeholder reflection on the process, and having that be an intentional space for problem solving. And so the labs brought together a diverse group of stakeholders it depended a little bit on each lab, but every 3 months, every 6 months, to sort of collectively reflect on the scaling process and talk about maybe what wasn't working well or what new challenges had arisen, and then together think of adaptations to address or test. And I think one of the benefits of this was, rather than having just the implementing organization identify this challenge, come up with something they want to test, and then have to sort of go sell or share this idea with all the different stakeholders, having sort of collectively come to the conclusion that maybe this wasn't working, and this is something we could test about it. Sort of there already was a consensus forged, and people felt more invested in it. And so it didn't seem so much as, reporting that we made this mistake as we've collectively identified this course correction we want to test. Certainly from a funding organization side, I think we've seen that the funders play a big role in setting the tone of whether it's accountability or more for learning. In terms of what type of reporting is asked for. Are they asking, are they sort of creating a space where it feels safe to share things that aren't going well or changes that were made? Are they even asking questions about what lessons were learned, or is it really about, how did you meet these outputs? Brad or Maya, do you have things to add?
Well, Molly, what you said, I think is exactly right. And so I might be redundant in just saying the same thing in a different way, but just to underscore that what we're finding is that it really comes from the funding organizations, and they are setting the incentives, whether these are soft systems or hard systems. And therefore we think about what it means to change the conversation and to just have different kinds of conversations, moving away from accountability and more from learning. And therefore, as Molly pointed out, sort of increasing the power of learning from one's mistakes and understanding that course correction is a natural part of the work. And then I also think that the extent to which funding organizations and other organizations can increase the capacity of qualitative research and qualitative researchers, there will likely be the effects of sort of asking the why questions and asking some of the deeper contextual and nuanced questions, rather than misunderstanding scaling as very simple and linear and kind of binary.
Thanks so much, Ursula, for your question on how we select questions for our A/B tests and youth impact. So in general, we think that this is something that should come from the programs team and or the curriculum and training team. So they are deciding on the A/B questions that we run, and they propose the majority of the A/B test questions. Then there is a third department involved beside the programs team and curriculum and training, and that's research and innovation. That's where I come from. We usually moderate that process, and we keep, a learning agenda for every program where we collect the ideas and structure the conversation. But ultimately, these are suggestions coming mainly from the programs team and also the curriculum and training team. And so typically what we do is we have about 2 sessions every term after implementation. One is to review the results from the previous term, and then a second session to preview what that means for our learning agenda and with which A/B tests we want to continue in the next implementation cycle.
Thanks.
Ishwa, I think you had your hand up from Learn to Play.
Hi, Ishwar from Learn to Play in Botswana, an organization working in early childhood development. and towards universal access in Botswana through playgroups and parenting programs. I have a couple questions, two specifically, I guess. One maybe to touch on what Brad briefly spoke about, and a second for Constantine. But I think the first one directed to Brookings or Brad is, I know there's probably plenty online, but is there any specific data research case studies in relation to the use and effectiveness of WhatsApp-based platforms and things in Southern African countries in terms of access to smartphones, availability of data, things like that, in order to effectively deliver programming directly through those platforms? And if so, it would be great to just know what's a good place to be looking at that specifically from a WhatsApp front. And then two, from Constantine's side, it's great to get to ask a couple questions. We work in a lot of the same places you do, but from a youth impact perspective, how do you view or how has youth impact built appropriate organizational capacity, either locally or through people working abroad in teams in research and innovation, to get to a point where you're really able to use data to leverage data decision making in your programs? And how have you gotten to a place where your teams, be it abroad or within Botswana, are able to actively deliver and create links between your program team and your research team to feed that back into your programs?
Maybe I'll say something quick about that first question and then turn it over to others. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any particular studies that meet the needs that you're describing, although I know they exist. I come across them occasionally. I might suggest that you look at the EdTech Hub. I bet they've got some things that they can share with you, and also Central Square organization. These are two groups that have been looking for and compiling ed tech studies, and they're searchable by topic. So I might suggest there. I know they exist. I just can't think of any right now off the top of my head.
Thanks.
Thanks, Eshwar, for your questions. Those are great questions. Let me give an opportunity to also answer to your first question. So COVID-19 was a big challenge for youth impact and for implementing teaching at the right level specifically, because that's implemented in schools. And so for 2 years, we had almost no opportunity to implement our direct delivery model and government delivery only at small scale. So one thing that we did during that time is we took the principles from teaching at the right level and applied them to a phone-based tutoring program, which is called Connected, which was also evaluated in a large RCT, first in Botswana and then in multiple follow-up trials in Kenya and Uganda, Philippines, and other countries. So that might be of interest to you. There is a study in Nature Human Behavior on the first trial in Botswana, and we are just working on a working paper to share the results on all these follow-up trials in different countries. So that's on your first question, and that's also part of the EdTech Hub initiative. So you will also find policy briefs on Connected through at the EdTech Hub. And on your second question, I think that's a great question. I only joined Youth Impact 1.5 years ago, so I cannot speak to how exactly the team was built up since the launch of Young Love or now Youth Impact. One thing that I can say for sure, what matters a lot is that data is really in the DNA of the organization. From top to bottom, everyone is fully bought into this idea that data matters and that we can learn from data. And I think that makes a big difference. I think that's important. So one reason why that's important, it's very natural for all the departments to engage with R&I on questions about learning, whether it's programs or curriculum, even our HR department, we have a lot of interactions essentially with all the departments on how we can use data and what we can learn from the data. We have regular meetings between managers from R&I and the programs, but also between R&I and curriculum and training. And, that those frequent interactions where we always, on a frequent basis, discuss what the data tells us. I think that just establishes this culture that allows us to, kind of establish feedback loops based on data, and not only experimental data, but also pre-post data, monitoring data, all sorts of data. And so I think that's important. I can say that that data is really in the DNA of the organization. In terms of being more specific about our research and innovation department, we have about half the team working remotely. Like I'm, for instance, calling now from Switzerland. We have other team members from Boston, Sweden, and the Netherlands, but then we also have a strong local presence that's important to you, that's important to our organization. We have several team members in Botswana. We are currently hiring for our office in Namibia, and we have team members in Malawi and Nigeria. So we want to, build up a team with local talent. Yeah, so that's what I can say. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, awesome. Appreciate both those answers and also the link in the chat. Thanks.
Anybody else have a question? I might ask one if no one has one before me. In our community, we have a mix of, education support organisations, we've got school networks, and then we have standalone schools. And I was just thinking, in the scenario of you're a standalone school, you've been going for a little bit, what you're doing is working, and you're thinking, I think I want to open up a new school, I want to expand. What do you think is what's the first kind of step? I know scaling is linear and is not linear, and there's so much to consider and all these different types of data and ways we should use it. But if we were trying to break it down into a beginner guide, what to do first, do you have any advice for that kind of organisation? And that could be for anyone, Brookings or the labs or Youth Impact. I'm keen to hear from anyone.
Molly, I might suggest that you take that on.
Thank you. So I think, one thing that comes up in sort of our research and in the broader scaling literature a lot is the importance of thinking about long-term, large, sustainable scale from the beginning, even before you're sure if you should scale, if you're sure that's the right thing to do, because it's really important to make sure that the innovation is not just designed to maximize impact, which I think is often our inclination, but in a way that is truly scalable, and so is simple enough and affordable enough to be able to be sustained with impact at large scale. And so I think one of the challenges we often see is that understandably, a lot of time and effort is spent really maximizing the initial innovation, and then finding that it's really not scalable for all sort of different reasons, because it's complexity, because of all the bells and whistles that are added. And so I think one thing to really think about early on is how, how might this scale? What would that look like? And what changes do we need to consider? And as we're moving from 1 to 2 schools, which is a small expansion, what would we want to try out that could hope to sort of eventually pave the way for that? I'm not sure if others want to add on to thoughts on this.
I think that's right. I wrote just a couple of quick notes. I would probably suggest that those folks get to know scaling as a concept and the principles of scaling and the literature around scaling very well. I would suggest that they get to understand the problem, the deep dimensions of the problem that they believe they are addressing. I would suggest that they get to know the landscape, the broader landscape very well. Who is doing similar work? Who's doing different kinds of work? What kind of competing interventions are there? What does the policy landscape look like? I would suggest engaging multiple groups of champions and stakeholders early on, thinking about all the kinds of people who might want to be brought into this and making sure to actually have the important conversations among multiple people early on. What is the funding going to look like? What kind of goal actually exists for the scaling work? What kind of pathways are there? What kind of challenges can one predict? What's it going to look like if this works out successfully along the way? I mean, these sort of introductory principles, activities, and conversations, I think, are incredibly important. And they can often take several months or even more than a year. But I think that best positions a group to think about if it's ready to scale, if it should scale, and how it might proceed with the scaling work.
Thank you very much. And Kanupriya, you raised your hand. Were you wanting to tag on to answering this question as well?
Yes, nowhere near the expertise that others on the panel have, but I just wanted to pitch in a little bit with just experience of watching schools grow from one school to hundreds of schools from time spent in India in the sector, really. And I feel like the difference in the conversation so far has been about scaling impact versus what we're talking about now is actually scaling provision. And I think when you're scaling provision, you have to look at scaling research in education, like Brad was saying, but it's also useful to look at scaling innovation in the retail sector. So it's a much more market-based, market-embedded sector, you know, the non-state schools, the kind of schools that would be in the forum, that would be looking to scale, I think. So that's the only little bit that I wanted to add on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Look at McDonald's.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to add to that question, to that response? Okay, perfect. Does anyone else have a new question? I might just ask a final question then, and if no one else has anything, we can always wrap up a little bit early. It was maybe just to come to the labs team and say, you know, for some of the organisations, especially organisations new to GSF who are getting to know what the labs are all about, obviously, you know, you have a specific theme and then successful applicants will receive your kind of mentoring and your coaching throughout that time space to help them grow and scale. But in terms of kind of general feedback, advice, or the things that you do to coach an organisation, do you have any sort of general tips to share with the community at large when you're talking about, okay, how do we work with this organisation to help them scale? I know that that's a very contextualized thing, but generally, are there anything that you come up against the same kind of points? Are organizations struggling with the same kind of things? Is there anything maybe general we could share with our community?
I'm happy to come in here, and then Habib, if you want to add anything on, please do. I think this is like quite difficult to be very general about stuff, but I think there's some things that have already been shared on this call which are really relevant. I think really near the beginning of the session, Brad mentioned you know, being really purposeful and understanding why you want to scale. And that is something that we work really closely with the organizations who are applying to the labs program, and then organizations who are successful in terms of what is your end goal? What is the purpose of scaling? We understand that not everything has to scale and not everything is supposed to scale, and that there are also multiple different avenues and pathways to scale. So really working closely with organizations and organization leaders to understand why they want to scale, what is the purpose of scaling, really with this mindset of the scaling impact rather than just scaling an innovation or scaling an organization. So that for us is like a really important place to start with organizations to really understand the purpose and understand the why, and making sure that it is focused on impact rather than, say, organization growth. And then I think the second thing is to share with community members that we are also creating and launching an Impact at Scale toolkit, which is going to be a collection of the resources and tools that we have been using with our Impact at Scale Labs participants. So watch that space. It'll be launching in January, available to all of our GSF community members. But that is another opportunity to engage with the same tools and resources and guidance that has been shared through the coaching process with the labs participants, and will give organizations kind of helpful hints of where to start, what to consider, and some tools and frameworks that they can use to think about their scaling journey, pathways, and strategies as well.
Perfect, thank you. Habib, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think mostly from moving from data as a reporting tool to data as a learning tool. I think majorly organizations need to build a culture within them, and also generally have an in-house team, a person who is focused on measuring and providing data to the rest of the team, because largely when you see data as an accountability tool, the team that focuses on collecting data is usually separate from the program team. There's less interaction between them. But if you want to learn and iterate really quickly your solutions, then your data collection process needs to be an integral part of your programming. So that as you're collecting data, whether through your software or manually, it's informing your design process, it's informing your implementation process, and you have very quick loops to inform how you're collecting, to improve how you're collecting data based on the program design, and also you're improving the program based on the feedback from the research team. So yeah, building the culture within the team, really important, and also having dedicated personnel to it within the programs team, or working directly with the programs team. And that's my simple addition. Thanks.
Great advice, thank you. And I saw that Konstantin and Ishwa, you put your hands up. So were you wanting to tag on to those responses too, or do you have fresh questions?
I have a question, so I'm going to pause and see if Konstantin did an addition to what is being currently said.
Yeah, I have an addition to what has been discussed. So one, I want to echo what Habib just said. You know, it's very important to establish these data flows to be as quick and automated as possible. We say in youth impact, data that defies gravity is really useless. So we also, you know, frequently reflect on which data flows we want to maintain and which ones we want to drop, because it just, you know, the data flow doesn't prove important enough. So we also constantly reflect on that, and we try to be as quick as possible. I'd say the value of data quickly depreciates, so the quicker you can feedback it to the programs team, the better. So we are constantly working on that. So I want to echo that. And just one thought on the scaling. I think, you know, that worked. I think it makes sense, and it worked very well for youth impact. What Brad also mentioned, you know, finding champions and then following those champions. Let me just give one example from Youth Impact in Botswana. So in the first years, we implemented in about 3 or 4 regions, and it then turned out that one of the regional directors, who is also responsible for primary schools and primary school quality that's administered at the region, one of the regional directors in those first 3 or 4 regions, Botswana has 10 regions in total, was very much bought into TARL, very much convinced, has grown into a champion. And once the organization realized that that we have a true champion in one of these regions, we invested a lot of resources to, you know, build up capacity and scale as quickly as possible in that region. Now, after I think 1 or 2 years, that regional director was assigned to a new region. So we essentially followed that regional director. That new region had 74 schools. Within, I think, 1 year, we reached all 74 schools in that region. It has been the first region in Botswana where we achieved 100% reach. And what was also nice in the region that the regional director left, you know, the incoming regional director was then briefed by the outgoing regional director, kind of established a similar buy-in for the program. And now these are the two large, you know, the first two regions where we reached a 100% scale in Botswana. So I think that just worked very well for Youth Impact. If you can establish, you know, a champion who, you know, supports you, that makes a huge difference. And just to maybe make it more practical, I don't think that applies for Botswana, but I witnessed that firsthand in Tanzania. Many Eastern African countries collect nationally standardized and ministered learning outcomes or assessments in primary schools, often in grade 4 and then at grade 7 before children move on to secondary school. And these are quite high stakes tests. And, you know, government officials care a lot about this data because at some point they are held accountable for the performance of their, you know, primary schools based on this data. And using that data to demonstrate the effectiveness of your program, that can go a long way in convincing governmental stakeholders to support the program. That was my experience from Tanzania, where we used the nationally standardized assessment for standard 7 children. And, you know, once they saw the results in those assessments, that really was the point where they got convinced for the program. All right, that's from my side. Thanks.
Thank you for adding that. Really valuable. So Ishra, I'll hand over to you for the final question, and then I will wrap us up and go into our poll.
Awesome. Thanks. I think this is one also really for anyone, but I mean, if Constantine wants to jump in, when we're looking at A/B testing, and you're looking at, you know, smaller scale organizations that are still sort of very much growing or maybe developing capacity to be able to use data to drive decisions, they may not have an R&I team yet, right? So you might have a CEO, a COO, something that's really trying to push the, you know, the usage of data. So how complex or simple do, for example, things like A/B testing that you're designing need to be in the questions that you're asking and the data you're collecting in order to utilize that? So for example, you know, I know you mentioned you've got a simple baseline question that you asked for your same level, multi-level groupings and an end line. You know, how much quantitative data does that need to be? How much can that be? 5 different yes or no questions on additional knowledge gained if you're assessing training. So how much training did you have? I mean, how much knowledge did you have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. Have you gained knowledge? Or has your knowledge improved in X and Y areas, yes or no? Or do you need to have a scale of how much has your knowledge improved on a scale of 1 to 10? So at a small level, when you don't have as much capacity, how complex do your questions need to be when looking at A/B testing to make that, you know, relevant to use internally, but then also then communicate externally?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I'd say in Youth Impact, generally, we strive for simplicity. So I'd say, you know, simple questions are often the best questions. There's no need to add many layers of complexity to a problem. You know, so I'd say if we have 2 questions and one of them is simpler than the other, I'd say we always lean to first answer the simpler question. So I think one of the beauties of A/B testing, I'd say also RCTs in general, I mean, conceptually, it's very easy to understand why it works, and it's not rocket science, you know, to implement it. I guess you need one senior team member who knows, you know, conceptually how experimental trials work. or at least, a team that knows how to collect data and collect data and establish data flows. I'd say that's maybe even more important. If you can't make the data flow, it's very difficult to run an A/B test. But once you know how to collect data pre and post, and once you establish those data flows to work properly, I think it's pretty straightforward to then, start running A/B tests. So we work with, different partner organizations that have reached out to us because they were interested in, establishing A/B testing routines. And I'd say what we look for the most is, one, most importantly, can they establish data flows? Can they make, can they collect data and feed into a system? If that's not if you can't collect data, then it's tricky. But when it comes to conceptually, evaluating then an A/B test and so on, I think those are pretty simple concepts that can be mastered pretty quickly. So it doesn't require a team with 10 PhDs. I think robust data flows, that's great. And then everything else falls into place, essentially.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm just going to share my screen as we kind of wrap up to share contact details, which I think are being dropped into the chat as well. So if you do think of any further questions, don't hesitate to contact the Brookings Institution and GSF. So Habib to talk about the labs, or Ursula, and then there's myself if you'd like to know more about GSF and the work we do and these Ask the Expert sessions. I just want to, we'll be launching a quick poll, which should be appearing on your screen now. If you could just answer those questions, that would be amazing, so that we can gather your feedback on the session and understand which topics you might like to see us cover in the future. So if Tejaswini, you could launch that poll, thank you. And I just want to say a big thank you to Brad, Maya, Molly from the Brookings Institution, and thank you for your continued support and collaboration with us. You're very valued, your expertise and the time you put in. And thank you very much to Constantine from Youth Impact for sharing your insights with us today. Thank you to Ursula and Habib for sharing what the labs are up to. And to everybody who's attended, thank you for joining again. We really hope to see you in a future Ask the Expert session, and details of future events that we're running, including spotlights, will be shared in our newsletter. So do keep